Hello everyone and welcome back to the next video in the vocal analysis series. We are going to be talking about Natsume today, and I apologize for the wait on this video. I of course managed to get sick right before, about a week before I was supposed to have my holiday break. It's been a bit of a struggle. I've still got a bit of a cough, so I'll probably have to cut the audio a lot in order to cough. You won't hear anything, but that's what'll be going on in the background, more than likely. So my original plan was to get this video out for Christmas. Obviously that didn't happen. Hopefully I do get it out before New Year's. It's December 30th right now. I don't think I'll have time to record all of the commentary today, but if I get the rest of it done tomorrow, I can probably get it out before 2025. We'll see how things go. But anyway, Natsume. So, Nojiken is actually one of the voice actors from Ensemble Stars that I was somewhat familiar with prior to Ensemble Stars. And he's someone that has a very distinct voice, to the point that, at least with more recent anime series, if he's voicing any characters, it's pretty easy to tell right away. But that wasn't always the case. The one series that I'm specifically referencing is One Piece, because I have been into One Piece for a very long time, and he voiced, I guess still voices, a character in that series that first showed up over 20 years ago at this point, so I actually went back to watch some of the old episodes just to hear it, and his voice isn't nearly as distinctive as it is these days. It's one of those things where going into it, obviously I knew what character he voiced, so knowing that in advance, you could hear parts of his voice that are still fairly distinctive, but a lot of it sounded a lot more generic in terms of, anime male character. He's Pell, by the way, for anyone wondering. But it was kind of interesting to go back and listen to that compared to a lot of the more recent characters that he's voiced. In terms of a singing comparison for other characters, there wasn't actually a whole lot I could find, despite him voicing a lot of characters that I'm familiar with. He doesn't really sing for a lot of them. And a lot of that was post-Ensemble Stars, so after he started voicing Natsume. I know prior to that he had a few of his own personal music projects that he'd done, but the one example that I'm going to show here, mostly because I think it does sound significantly different from Natsume, so it's a good contrast, is Chosun from Touken Ranbu. And I'm sure starting this series, you all thought I would talk about Idolish 7 a lot, mostly because the first few characters I did also share voice actors with Idolish 7 characters, but there's not many of those left. However, about half of the cast of Ensemble Stars is also in Touken Ranbu, and if they were in any of the anime series, they have probably sung. So it's a very easy place for me to pull comparisons from. You'll hear about it a lot. Granted, there are a lot of characters in Touken Ranbu, so it's probably not that surprising. There's a lot of overlap, but you're going to be hearing me talk about Sword Boys in a lot of these videos, so heads up for that. But anyhow, here we go. So I think the most interesting thing with this example is that you can still hear a lot of the vibrato style that Natsume will use as we go through this video. Tonally, there's a little bit, especially in the middle section, that has the effects overlaid on it where you can hear his voice sounds quite similar, but a lot of it is not really the same. So I thought this was a good contrast, because in listening to some of Nojiken's just kind of personal work, or when he's been singing songs from other series for events or whatever, his voice still sounds fairly similar to Natsume, so this was the most different I could find, and it technically is character singing, so I think it counts. And because this is the first character from Switch that we're doing, I'm going to talk a little bit about Switch as a unit. And Switch has always been kind of hard for me to pin down musically, because their general MO seems to be insert genre here, but make it electronic. So they don't necessarily have a specific slot that they fit into. Like last time we talked about Yuta, To Wink is mostly electronic pop music. If we look at a group like Eden that has EDM influences, there's a lot more of kind of the hip-hop side of it. Switch is somewhere in the middle, but they do so many different genres. They've done pop, they've done straight-up EDM, they've done more techno-influenced music, they've done disco, they've done kind of EDM-inspired lounge music, they've done music that sounds like it could be in a musical. So there isn't really one box that they fit into, which makes their discography extremely varied, and again, interesting to listen to because of that. When talking about their individual voices, one of the things I realized going through the music is that there are actually very few duets that happen. For the most part, they're either singing solo or they're singing as a group of all three of them. So I pulled out the duets here and there where I can, but just know that the reason that there aren't a lot of them isn't because I just didn't pick a lot of them, it's because there literally aren't a lot of them that exist. And all three of the characters in Switch have very distinct voices. There's never really a question of who's singing when you listen to them. In terms of vocal blending, I think the producers have a pretty good handle on what sounds good. But again, we won't focus on that a whole lot outside of the duets. It's just kind of a general overview of what Switch as a unit sounds like. But I think I've probably rambled on long enough, as always, so let's get into the music.
誰にも作り出せないさあ準備はいいかな目覚めるよりも早くめくように惑わすように魔法をかけるよ後悔者にはさせない望むほどに Endless like a chemist 色妻が君を貫く
So the first thing you'll probably notice with Natsume is that he has very fast, very tight vibrato, which comes out mostly at the end of lines or phrases on more sustained notes. Temptation Magic is one of the more EDM-y songs in their discography, at least in terms of the fact that it has an actual beat drop, and it's a very good beat drop. People had a lot to say about it when the song first came out. I still enjoy listening to it. We also have duets with both Tsumugi and Sora in this one. Tsumugi's voice generally is one that's fairly easy to blend with. It's fairly smooth, it's fairly neutral, so he's going to sound good with pretty much anybody. Sora, on the other hand, he's the one character where sometimes I find the mixing with him to be a little bit off. And generally the way they try and compensate for that is to make his voice very low in the mix volume-wise. So if you listen to him sing with pretty much any other character, they kind of take the volume on Sora's voice down almost as much as they can, so you can still hear him, but it's not the most prevalent voice in the mix.
始めるんだ僕らのステージ表情を変えたスペシャルな儀式のスタートさ君だけに聞く魔法のフレーズその僕らの間に流れてくるのはどっと Knocking on your heart
So Knockin' Fantasy, we have a few more longer sustained notes, and you can hear that with those, he basically has no vibrato whatsoever. It's a really nice long sustained note, and that's something we've spoken about in previous videos, where being able to control your vibrato is an intentional technique, and one that's not necessarily easy. In terms of tone, I would say that Natsume's voice trends more toward the nasal side of things, and you'll probably find this with a lot of character singing, because especially if someone is adjusting their voice a lot to fit a certain character, normally they're going to adjust it up, and anytime you're taking your tone higher, it kind of naturally will go into sounding more nasally because that's just the part of your breath structure that you're utilizing. For characters that are using much deeper voices, you won't hear it quite as often because they're intentionally going lower within the chest voice, down more towards the diaphragm. But anytime you have a character that has a slightly higher voice, you'll find that it tends to trend nasal because of that. And again, I feel I always have to disclaim, having a nasal tone is not a bad thing. It does not mean that you're singing through your nose. It does not mean that your nose is plugged when you're singing. It just is a certain sound to the voice. Generally, I always find it to sound quite warm, and I typically enjoy a bit of that when I'm listening to characters sing. But again, nothing wrong with it. Doesn't mean there's anything technically bad about his singing. It's just something that the voice does.
街を彩る卵たち見つけたらハッピースマイル転がしたら魔法をかけるからイリュージョンだって気づく日なんだ自由に飛び立っていくのさその期待が歌ってあげるそう金星で言えたデミュージョン
I realize going through this, the Switch has a lot of holiday-specific songs. Easter Carnival is the highest we've heard Natsume sing so far, and it gets into what I think is one of the most interesting things about his voice, is that he doesn't really have a head voice. And we've spoken a little bit before about what head voice is. For most people, when they reach the break in their voice, you can hear a shift in the way that their tone sounds. Natsume doesn't have that, because he's going into notes here that are fairly high, and we'll hear songs later where it pushes even higher. And I would have to imagine that it's going past the natural break in Nojiken's voice, but his tone sounds identical, and it's really interesting to listen to. I think in the Eiichi video I'd also talked about how some people differentiate head voice and falsetto. This is one of those instances where I think it is probably a good idea to do that, because Nojiken does have a falsetto, and he does use it much later on. We'll get there when we get there. That is very distinct, but what I would consider his head voice, not so distinct from his normal singing tone, which means that he can hit a very wide range of notes and have his voice sound almost exactly the same for all of them. I think Natsume's voice is very well suited to these kind of slower, almost ballad-esque songs like Galaxy Destiny. He's another one of those singers that tends to sing a little bit behind the beat, and he has this very almost hypnotic sense to his voice when it gets going, which I think is really evident in his first solo. Again, we'll talk about that when we get there. And this is another example of a song where he is going quite high, and I do want to differentiate again that he's not belting. There's nothing within the way that his voice sounds that would indicate to me that it's a belt. And I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I guess I have to just in case some people aren't watching every single one of these videos. Belting is when you are singing notes that would normally be sung in your head voice, but you're pushing your chest voice to do it instead. So it's a different type of technique. Usually there's a different sound to it. Generally it's a lot louder and more powerful. Here again, he's hitting notes in what sounds like his chest voice, but probably isn't, and keeping the exact same tone the entire time. There's one little part at the end where it sounds like he's almost slipping into what might be a falsetto, but it's so quick that it's hard to get a read on it. Again, we'll get to actual falsetto later on. So Emerald Planet is probably the most disco-esque song in their discography. It's one that I like a lot. I actually think the special beat map for this is incredibly fun. It was one where I did take the time to watch example videos and learn where you kind of have the notes going backwards or not actually appearing on screen. And now that I've memorized it, it's actually really fun to do, but that's neither here nor there. What I mostly wanted to talk about in this one is that he does have quite a number of lower notes compared to some of the higher notes we've heard in the last couple of songs. And again, the underlying tone of his voice is exactly the same regardless of what note he's singing pretty much. There's also a part at the end of it where, and he does this a few times, and again, this is not necessarily an easy thing to do. There are a few singers in OnStars that do it fairly often, but the very last part when he is sustaining the note and actually pushing it so that instead of it fading away, it gets louder, which takes a lot of breath control and a lot of vocal control in general. So that at the end there, I think, is a more classic example of what head voice sounds like, but it's still very, very similar to his chest voice. Similar enough that there's not really a whole lot to tell between them, even though that has to be over his vocal break. At this point, you can also hear that he is controlling his vibrato a lot more than he was in the beginning, where everything was very fast and rapid. Here, he kind of shifts it depending on the note. Sometimes with the longer sustained notes, it'll be a much slower vibrato, which sounds more natural. On some of the notes that have a quicker release, he'll still kind of use that fast one. We talked about before how he can sustain notes without vibrato. So it's a nice shift hearing how even these little technical things are improving 2 years after he recorded the initial songs for Switch's debut.
瞬間うつむいてる前から気づいちゃってごめん言葉だけじゃ嘘くさいねそれたちの魔法は解けたりしないよ It's a magic for your switch 別に鏡に聞かなくても今日は選ばなかった色が海の笑顔いつだって守ってる
Again, very nice sustained note at the end, very minimal vibrato on it. This is one song where I would say that he is actually getting into what I would consider belting in the one part. Mostly because you can hear how much breath is being pushed behind the words and how kind of quickly they're cut off because of it. So that distinction in the tone to me implies more of a belt than he's done before. But again, the thing I'm going to keep emphasizing throughout this video is that seemingly no matter what kind of vocal technique he's using, his voice never really changes how it sounds. And obviously, since Switch was a newer unit, they never actually had a first album, so that actually brings us to the end of the 1!! Era. But even within these kind of 7 or 8 songs, however many there were there, you can hear an obvious vocal progression, and that will continue into the 2!! Era. So let's look at those songs now. 浮かべてあの日話してくれた綺麗な夢僕らが選んだ世界行き交う思いのかけらの遠い空まで続く眠る思いのかけらは So there's nothing really new in Omoi no Kakara that we haven't heard before. Nobody has asked about this, but I feel like I should talk about it anyway, because I know with my song names I kind of switch between sometimes like the Japanese, sometimes a mix, sometimes the translation. Mostly it's just how I think of the songs and also kind of collectively how I've mostly heard of them. Like for Omoi no Kakera, I've never really heard anyone call it Fragments of Feelings, even though you could translate it, but my brain is weird like that. It latches onto one thing and that's how I know it by, so the song names don't really mean anything scientifically, it's just how I think of them. So if you're ever wondering why there's a mix of everything, that's probably why. As I've said before, slower songs suit Natsume's style of singing very well. This is probably the longest example of duets we have, specifically with Tsumugi, so you can actually hear the vocal blending, and the two of them do sound very good together. So it's nice to actually hear full phrases of them singing together. I've always kind of felt like Brilliant Smile is a bit of an outlier in Switch's discography because they don't really have any other songs that incorporate that much rhythmic, almost half rapping style into the music itself. But I still like it. Natsume doesn't get a whole lot of features in this one, but you can hear, especially for his solo lines, they are quite low, and he's still maintaining that same tone throughout. This is also kind of the first example where, as I said before, Natsume tends to sing behind the music a little bit, so songs that are slower, have a little bit more of a flowy feel to them, really suit his vocal styles. In this one, he is singing with the percussion, and he's able to keep up with it. So he doesn't get to do it a lot, but obviously it shows that he can when he needs to. I like the end of A Little Bit Up because you can actually hear him singing without any sort of backing track or instrumental behind him, so you just get his voice, and I always like when they do that because it lets you hear it a lot better. The other thing with this one I wanted to point out is that something Ensemble Stars has started doing after the release of music, they never really did it much before, is actually letting vocalists sing over the rest of the group. So you might have an individual solo happening while the rest of the singers are doing something else. And there's a handful of these I can think of from like the old era, but it does tend to happen a lot more often now. Natsume has a big one here, which is this one, where again, he's singing quite high, he's sustaining notes, he's singing over what Tsumugi and Sora are doing, kind of singing the under part of it. And it does sound really good. It's something I wish they would honestly do more of, because I think a lot of their vocalists can handle it perfectly fine. It typically shows off their voices a lot more and lets them do kind of little vocal ornamentations and tricks that you normally wouldn't do if you were just singing a solo line. So I'm glad it happens here. I know I have been critical of the 5-star feature songs in pretty much all of the past videos. Romancing Cruise, I think, fits Natsume probably better than any of the other ones we've talked about so far. Maybe because it was the last song in Switch's rotation, so the music producers kind of figured out how to actually feature the 5-star character in the song. But it is one of those almost electronic lounge music style songs that suits his voice very well. He's not doing a whole lot vocally that we haven't heard before, but it's all things that are well within his wheelhouse. There's a little bit of syncopation between his voice and the music in some of the middle sections. He's got a lot of nice sustained notes. So I think, especially compared to some of the other ones like this that we've talked about so far, this is probably the best one we've run into up until this point. In terms of the 5-star unit event song actually fitting the character that the event is supposedly based around.
かくれんぼはもう終わりだよ教室の席のトントンと机に隠した箱を叩く前思いがまた増える
This is one of the ones I was talking about before where I said that Switch had some songs that feel like they could be in musicals. Like this feels like it could be in a Disney movie and it wouldn't be out of place. I think it's the really rapid strings that happen throughout the backing track. But this is another one where, at least in terms of Natsume's solos, a lot of them happen without much going on in the background, or at least the instrumental tracks are quite low in the mix compared to his voice. Interestingly, this is one of the songs where he is almost cutting out the vibrato completely, which seems like it should be the opposite, because normally if you have songs that sound musical-esque, you would want to bring out more of those vocal styles, more of the vibrato, more of the open vowels, and Natsume's voice in this is actually fairly reserved, but technically I think, again, it showcases that if he wants to cut out vibrato completely, he can, and it sounds great. It doesn't sound like his pitch is wavering at all. So while there's not a whole lot that's new here in terms of things that he hasn't done before, it's a good showcase for that, especially, as I said, because the music is so low, you can really hear his voice throughout.
重ねた季節感じて毎日描くその色は希望を抱く朝も挫折しそうな夜も終わらずに駆け抜けてく君との今日までを包んでるどこにいたって繋がっているから君との絆感じて進もう
I remember going to look at the lyric spread for this one because I haven't really talked about my process much for recording these songs, but thank you, Happy Elements, for finally putting your music on global Spotify, because this makes it so much easier to do something like this and have relatively high quality music to go along with it. But usually what I'll do is I'll go onto the wiki, I'll look at the vocal divisions, and then I'll play the song and record the parts that match up with the lyrics that the character is singing. This one is basically all really long solos and then unison parts. So a lot of the solos in this are quite a bit longer. I've still tried to keep the whole thing to about 30 seconds, but Natsume does actually sing more than this, sometimes repeated melodies. So if there are sections where it's the exact same part of the song just with different lyrics, I sometimes won't include that just to keep things a little bit more condensed. But again, we can hear him at least a couple of times popping up into what I would consider head voice, at least as far as Natsume is concerned. Otherwise, again, nothing that we haven't heard too much of before. He's kind of switching between vibratos depending on the part of the song, which I feel like he's gotten more comfortable with as time has gone on. Even though he's always been proficient at all of them, it feels like he's mixing them together a little bit more than he was in the beginning. And that is actually the end of the Switch song, so we'll move into the other group songs now.
反射するミラーボール載せたいそれぞれのミュージック一つに重なる時宇宙で一番無邪気なスター中生まれたてのシークレット感じて熱いリズム
I had some people in the Ray video asking why I was using this version of Eccentric Party Night as opposed to the remixed, redone version that came out with the anime. But the simple answer is that I just like this one better. I like the arrangement better. I think the voices stand out a little more. It's not so produced. And that's kind of my little quibble with some of the more recent OnStar songs, is that sometimes I feel like they overdo the production a little bit. I feel that way with a lot of the second solos, so I actually kind of like the more raw, natural style that some of the older music had. And on top of that, I was in the fandom when this one was released, and just the reaction to it, because we had no idea we were getting an Eccentric song at the time. And when the previews came out, everyone just kind of lost it collectively. So I think there's that kind of nostalgia adding into it as well. But I just really like it as a song, so I'm going to be using it unless there's something really different between the two that I can compare with. And in this case, really the biggest thing to talk about is that it's the first time we get to hear Natsume singing with people that aren't Switch, at least in the way this video is set up. And they actually do some interesting things here. I think I talked about probably in the Fine video, how Egu is pretty good at turning off the Wataru affectations when he's actually singing with other people. And Rei and Shu both have voices that are significantly different from Natsume's, so when they sing together, it's very easy to hear both parts. Kanata is the most interesting here because Kanata obviously has a very strong character voice, but instead of what they do when Natsume sings with Sora, where they try and kind of eliminate Sora's voice as much as they can in the mix, here they actually have them at equal volume, so they're blending together instead of fighting against each other. And that won't always work, because sometimes if you have two people using character voices or a really strong character voice, it's just going to clash regardless of what you do. But in this case, they actually work really well together, so it's interesting hearing the differences in vocal blending depending on what characters are singing together. The only other thing I'm going to talk about here is I know I had recommended going to watch the live version of this from the fourth Starry stage. It's like the second night of the July concerts for Rei's video because of Masun, but honestly, watch it for all of them. It's just really great. Again, it was something that nobody knew was happening before it did happen, so it was good all around. But the one thing I wanted to point out is in that version of it, Nojiken actually does this little, in music we would call it an ornament, or more specifically a mordant, which is basically where you start a note that is intended to be on one pitch, on that pitch, move up to a different pitch, and then come back to it within the same note. And I'm not going to play the audio because technically the live concerts aren't supposed to be shared, so I am going to respect that, even though, as I said in the Rei video, you can find it pretty easily. But essentially what he does, and this is going to be very embarrassing because I actually have to sing to prove my point here, on Mirror Ball, in the original he just goes, Miraboru, whereas in the live one he does this, Miraboru. I apologize for the singing, I'm sure my voice isn't exactly back to where it should be after being sick, but hopefully it wasn't too bad, and I hope it got the point I was trying to make across. Regardless, whenever I hear this song, and specifically that part, I always think about the live version because he does that, and he actually does that as Natsume in a song we're going to talk about in a little bit, so I thought I would bring it up here because it is related to something we're going to talk about. So in terms of vocal mixing, everything we talked about in Eccentric Party Night mostly applies in Twilight Pentagram because he's singing with the same characters and he does get to sing with all of them as opposed to Rei. I think what I find the most interesting about this song is I know in the Ray video we talked about how low Ray's voice stays throughout the entire song comparatively to most of the songs that he sings in, whereas Natsume starts out really low and then about halfway through the song he transitions much higher, to the point that his last duets with Ray and Shu, their voices are, in terms of pitch, they are extremely far apart, and you can really hear both of them. And I tried to put both of his duets with Shu in there because he does have an earlier one where they're singing much closer together. So I thought that was something to note, that Natsume's voice kind of progresses throughout the song until at the end he's singing in what, at this point, we're just going to call his head voice, because technically that's what it is. So as with most of these cross-unit songs, there aren't a whole lot of individual solo or duet parts. This is kind of the closest song genre-wise to Brilliant Smile that he sings in, which makes sense because they're singing with Eden, and as I said way back at the beginning of the video, Eden typically has more of the hip-hop side of EDM, so it makes sense to put their units together. Again, I really would like to sit down with the producers of Ensemble Stars and ask them how they divide the duets, because we've got an entire unit for Natsume to potentially sing with, and he sings half a line with Ibarra, and then his only other duet is with Sora. So I don't know how they decide this. I think, as was proven in the Eccentric songs, Natsume sounds good with a lot of different voices, so there's no reason he shouldn't have been able to sing with other members of Eden, but somehow that didn't happen. But going back to how it's similar to Brilliant Smile, it's because it's very rhythmic, and in this one he actually has a part that's closer to rapping, I think, than anything he did in Brilliant Smile. So we get a little bit of what his voice might sound like there. Again, he's very good at staying on beat when he needs to. There's just not a whole lot in these songs to talk about in terms of individual vocalists because they don't get a lot of features due to the number of characters involved. That's really all he has in Tell Your World, and I talked about this a little bit in the Yuta video. It makes sense, considering that we got Vocaloids and Non-Stars, they would need to be the focus. And also, like I said in the Yuta video, the human vocalists, with the exception of Sora, are all singing much lower than they typically would. This is probably the lowest Natsume's voice ever gets, and he is still maintaining that same tone. He's not getting into that whisper stage where the notes would be too low for him to sing on pitch. It still sounds really nice. I kind of wish he would use that really low tone of voice more, because it sounds even warmer than his normal tone. And he does get to sing with Miku, so that's a thing. He might get to sing with Miku more, depending on what they do with the Project Sekai collab they announced this week, which is exciting. I assume there'll be, well, I know there is a song that goes along with it. Obviously, that's not going to be in this video because it won't officially be released for a couple of months, but hopefully some of the characters involved will get to talk about that, because with the exception of Akito, who I believe Project Sekai is kind of his first big role, the other three are all singers that I was familiar with before I started playing Project Sekai, and I didn't start at the beginning. I started in like summer of 2022, so it's been a couple of years, but I knew Tsukasa and Rui's voice actors from other projects, but primarily from A3. Toya's, obviously, I know from Hypnosis Mic, so hearing that coming together in a song with the OnStars characters I think will be really interesting, so I do hope I get to talk about that in at least one of these videos when we get to that point. Another really short one. This was the first shuffle unit, so I feel like, again, they were kind of getting used to how to divide all of these things. He, once again, only gets to sing with like half of the shuffle unit. He doesn't get to sing with Kaoru or Chiaki at all. He has a very short line with Nikki, and he'll sing more with Nikki later, so we'll probably talk about that more then. And then one line with Mitsuru. And Mitsuru, obviously, his voice has changed because his literal voice actor has changed. He's another one of those characters that has a very strong character voice, maybe even more so now than before, because the new voice actor is obviously trying to imitate as close as he can to what the old voice actor was doing. Still sounds fine with Natsume, because Natsume's voice, despite it being very distinct, is not actually that hard to blend with, as we've found out going through this.
にいるの危なっかしくて可愛いなえてあげるからねえどんな言い訳でもその唇から聞かせてよ
I talk about the producers getting better at the Division and the Shuffle Unit songs, and then we have this one, which is one of the newest ones, and he only sings with Hokuto. So, I do want to clarify that there are sections in some of these songs where he's singing in a trio. Normally I don't pick those out because it's much harder to speak about the different vocal blending when there are more than two voices at the same time and more difficult to hear it. There is a little bit of that. I think he has trios with Hajime and Ritsu at the same time, but the only single character he gets to sing with here is Hokuto. And Hokei's voice, again, is very deep, pretty easy to blend with regardless of who he's singing with. They sound good together. For Natsume's part, he's kind of gone back to that really quick vibrato, which I think suits the style of the song. You get a little bit of, it's kind of electronically altered, but you get to hear his speaking voice a little bit at the end there, which again, I like putting in these videos when I can, just to kind of get the baseline of how their voices compare. And I feel like I said this at some point and then cut it out when I was doing the editing of the initial commentary, but Natsume singing and speaking voices are very similar to each other, which certainly isn't the case for every OnStars character, but really is for him.
君が嘘みたいだって青いカンバスに描けたなのにいつでもありのままでそばにいて僕はまた次のセリフを探すありたくなるんだありのままの君のこと考え続けてたことがあるよ涙で笑った
Alright, so here we go. Just like in the Eiichi video, I am once again going to mention how interesting it is that we have this song that is essentially a joke song that they did for April Fools, that in the game you really can't hear it all because of everything else going in the video, and there is so much good vocal work being done, and so much vocal work that is unique from anything the characters have done before. So, just like with Eiichi, we're going to talk about that a little bit. And also like Eiichi, the only people he sings with in this song, because as I said in that video, my headcanon is that Natsume will never sing with Eiichi, regardless of what universe they're in. The only people he sings with are Nikki and Madara, who, again, don't necessarily have similar voices to each other, but have a similar tone placement where they're singing, which is actually, again, fairly similar to Natsume's in a way that they sound good when they're blending together. In terms of the solo work that Natsume does, you can hear an example of what I was talking about with Eccentric Party Night, actually in the vocals for this one, that little vocal ornamentation that he does, which happens here. And we get falsetto for the first time. True, what I would call true falsetto from Natsume in the last part, which I will play again here. And again, just like I've said in the other videos, I really wish OnStars would not be afraid to let their voice actors go into falsetto because most of them can handle it perfectly fine. Like in this case, when he hits the falsetto, it's very clean and then he slides out of it, which is another kind of technique you can do. We talked about doing the vocal cry in Yuta's video as a way to more easily flip into head voice or into falsetto. One of the other ways you can either go up to or come down from a note is kind of doing this vocal slide technique, which Natsume does here, and you can hear it settle back into his regular tone when he hits the bottom of it. And that does it for everything except the solos, so let's take a look at those next. So the impression that I've always gotten is that, at least among the first round of solos, Secret Gravity is kind of universally looked at as one of the best ones, and it was going to be very hard for Natsume to have a second solo that people would feel more strongly about than this one. And there's a few characters I can think of that are kind of in the same boat. The most obvious I can think of being Kaoru and Miko, where I feel like people really, really liked their first solos. And I understand why Secret Gravity is so beloved within the fandom, because even though there's nothing technically difficult about the singing itself, The style of the music suits Natsume's voice so well. It once again has that really flowy, almost electronic ballad feel to it. It's got that really hypnotic quality that he slips into in the way that the rhythm kind of keeps going back and forth. Even though it's in 4/4 time, the rhythm feels like it's swaying just because of the way that he's singing. So all of that combined together, I think, creates a song that really does suit Natsume. Lyrically, again, some of the first solos are kind of like he's singing to someone else that's not really specified, so it's supposed to be a little bit flirty, and it kind of, his second solo goes into that as well. I feel like the second one lyrically has a bit more personal growth within it than this one does, but this is one of those cases where the song itself is so good that I feel like the lyrics don't become quite as important. So it's really nice to listen to all of the vocal work. Again, nothing super out of the box, but very proficient. It's a really good song.
本当にふとしたことさ今日という日が互いの心結んで強くするよ This young love 会おうよ繰り返して正しい日々の中で知れ渡ってくれ
So here's the thing. I've actually listened to What a Kind Echo You Pass more in the last few days because I've been trying to figure out what parts I want to cut out of it for this video. It's actually really good. Like, I feel like, again, people talk up Secret Gravity so much that this one kind of gets forgotten about, but it's one of the more pure EDM songs in the sense that it has the build up to the drop that you hear in a lot of other EDM music. It's very catchy. Like I said before, I think lyrically it at least goes a little bit deeper than Secret Gravity does into Natsume's character. It's a very different style. It's far more upbeat. It's not nearly as kind of vibey or relaxing as Secret Gravity is, but it's the more I listen to it, the more I'm like, I really can't choose between these songs. They're so different, but they're both really good. And I feel like What a Kind Echo You Pass is very underrated after hearing it a few more times. It's very well put together. It's one of those times where overproduction helps it because of the style of music that it is. It doesn't feel overproduced because that's just how EDM music in general is. So it actually fits what it's supposed to be doing. And this one does have a bit more in terms of vocal work as well, especially at the end. He has what we talked about in A Little Bit Up. This time he's obviously just singing over the backing vocals, which aren't necessarily other characters in this case, but he does the same kind of thing where he gets this really prevalent solo part above what the background vocals are doing. And again, sounds great. I'm glad they decided to let him do this because, as I've said before, a solo is supposed to be a showcase of the character, whether that be lyrically showing their growth, whether that be showcasing their vocal capabilities. So anytime that there's a solo that does one or both of those things, I feel like it's achieved its goal. And I think in this case, both of these songs show off different facets of Natsume that are part of his character. So I like both of them. My recommendation is that if you haven't listened to his second solo much, I'd say give it another try because I certainly was surprised hearing it again, so who knows, maybe it'll come to be appreciated more in the future, but I think it deserves more accolades than it's gotten so far. And that brings us to the end. I don't know how long this is going to be. I feel like it'll be long again because I apparently can't stop talking. It is now December 31st. I'm going to try and get this all edited together and up before midnight my time so I can say that I've gotten it up before the new year. I think in going through this, I don't know if there's necessarily anything new that I've learned about Natsume's voice, but I think it validates a lot of my original opinions. I still think his voice is fascinating. There are so many interesting qualities to it that really do come out in the music, and I'm looking forward to whenever he gets his second feature 5-star unit event, because typically the second ones have been better in terms of showcasing the vocalists, so I hope that we'll continue with the characters that haven't gotten their second one yet. But in general, I just love his voice a lot, and I'm sure that shows throughout the video. Coming up next, as I said in the last video, I'm going to be tackling the big units, so I'm doing Kanata next, and then someone from Nights. I still haven't quite decided who, so if you have someone you would really like me to do, please let me know. As I said, if I get a lot of responses for the same character, I'll probably do that one first, but we'll see what happens. Otherwise, I hope you have a good new year. All the best to all of you in 2025. Thank you again for the support this project has received so far. I've had some people saying these videos are underrated, which I really do appreciate. But if you feel that way and you'd like to share them or tell your friends to watch or whatever, that's totally fine. As always, like, comment, do all the things the algorithm wants you to do, and I will see you next time.